They These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Engage.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Moscow hosts Iran, Turkiye, and Syria. More details to come. Quadrilateral meeting on Syria to be held in Moscow on 15-16 March. A meeting on Syria at the level of deputy foreign ministers between Turkey, Russia, Iran, and Syria will be held in Russia's capital on 15-16 March, Turkish diplomat sources said on Monday, Anadolu news agency reports. The meeting will be attended by Turkish Deputy Foreign Minister Burak Occupier, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov, their Syrian counterpart Ayman Suzan, and Ali Asghar Kaji, a senior advisor to Iran's foreign minister. Last week, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu announced that a Turkish delegation will visit Moscow for technical talks ahead of a planned Turkish, Russian, Iranian, and Syrian foreign ministers meeting. The Iranian side will also attend this meeting. At this meeting's preparations for the ministers' meeting will be held. Cavusoglu said at a joint news conference with his Iranian counterpart, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, in the capital, Ankara. On 28 December 2022, the Turkish, Russian, and Syrian defense ministers met in Moscow to discuss counterterrorism efforts in Syria and agreed to continue the tripartite meetings to ensure stability in Syria and the wider region. About the possibility of the inclusion of Iran into the talks, Turkey previously said Ankara would be pleased if Iran's involved in the process. Although no date or location has yet been announced, the foreign ministers' meeting would mark another high-level talk since the Syrian civil war began in 2011. And also from Memo, Syrian President Assad arrives in Moscow, will meet Putin. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad arrived in Moscow on Tuesday on his first official visit outside the Middle East since last month's devastating earthquake, according to a statement from the Syrian presidency via the Telegram messaging app Reuters reports. Assad will hold talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin during his visit, alongside a large Syrian ministerial delegation, the statement said. A Kremlin statement said the two leaders would discuss cooperation in the political, trade, and humanitarian spheres, as well as prospects for an overall settlement of the situation in and around Syria. Russia launched a military campaign in Syria in 2015 that helped to turn the tide in the civil war in favor of Assad with massive aerial bombardment of opposition-held areas. It helped Assad to regain much of the territory he lost to rebels who sought to topple him. Moscow has since expanded its military facilities in the country with the permanent air base in Maymim in Syria's Latakia province. Russia's naval base in the Mediterranean coastal city of Tartus is the Russian Navy's only permanent warm water post outside the former Soviet Union. Western intelligence says Russia's costly war in Ukraine has forced it to push some assets from Syria, although the country remains Moscow's firmest foothold on the southern flank of NATO. The visit coincides with the 12th anniversary of the uprising in Syria that began with peaceful demonstrations in March 2011. The protest turned into an armed revolt after Assad used force to crush the opposition. It spiraled into a multi-sided conflict, which has sucked in neighbors and world powers and caused the largest displacement crisis since World War II. And from FGN, Russia talks between Putin and Syrian president today. Economic humanitarian cooperation will be discussed on many issues. Russian president to hold talks with Syrian counterpart. Russian President Vladimir Putin will hold talks with his Syrian counterpart, Bashar Assad, in Moscow on Wednesday. Current issues of Russian-Syrian political trade, economic humanitarian cooperation, and development will be discussed for a comprehensive solution for the situation in Syria and in its surroundings. According to Russian media TASS, Putin and Assad last met in September 2021 when the Syrian president visited Moscow. Assad has visited Moscow several times for talks with Russian counterpart. Previous talks between the two countries were held in May 2018. Previous talks between the two countries were held in May 2018, October 2015, and November 2017. Moreover, the presidents of the two countries had a meeting in November 2020 and spoke on the phone in early February this year. The president of Russia visited Syria twice. Putin's visited Syria twice in recent years, in December 2017 and January 2020, to meet with Assad. According to media reports, Assad arrived in Moscow on Tuesday on an official visit. A large delegation of ministers came with him. From Rudaw.net, Syria's Assad to meet ally Putin in Moscow. Syrian President Bashar Assad is set to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday in Moscow ahead of a quadripartite meeting of the deputy foreign ministers of Turkey, Russia, and Syria with an Iranian senior advisor. The Kremlin confirmed that Putin will meet Assad on Wednesday on the 12th anniversary of the Syrian war in a statement via Russian state news agency TASS. Both leaders are expected to talk further development of Russian-Syrian cooperation in the political, trade, economic, and humanitarian spheres, as well as the prospects for a comprehensive settlement of the situation in and around Syria, per the statement from Kremlin. The meeting comes ahead of an anticipated meeting of the deputy foreign affairs ministers of both countries with Turkey and Iran to discuss counterterrorism efforts in Syria. The meeting was initially to be tripartite, but Iran was added to the discussion after expressing the country's desire to be part of the conversation. Received by Mikhail Bogdanov, Russia's deputy foreign minister and Putin's special representative in the Middle East, Assad landed in Moscow, along with a delegation from his ministerial cabinet, reported the Syrian state media. The trip marks Assad's first official trip outside the Middle East since the devastating earthquake that shook Syria on February 6 that killed more than 6,000 people in the war-afflicted country. Russia's been Assad's strongest ally throughout the war that initially began as an uprising turned into a brutal civil war. Over 12 years of conflict in Syria resulted in destruction across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, injured, displaced as a result of the brutalities, and over 500,000 people have been killed in the conflicts, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and displaced more than half of the country's pre-war population. Al-Assad's visit to Moscow, a drive for normalization with Ankara. This is English Ina Abaladi. Concessions to get aid. Following the announcement of Al-Assad's visit to Moscow, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu revealed that a four-way meeting at the level of deputy foreign ministers will be held in Moscow next week with the participation of the Syrian regime, Turkey, Russia, Iran. The failure of the Syrian regime and the Kremlin to comment on the reasons for al-Assad's visit to Russia opened the door to questions about the importance of the visit and the issues that will be discussed during al-Assad's presence in Moscow. The upcoming visit to Moscow is the fifth of its kind after the outbreak of the protest in Syria, and it's the first visit that was announced before it happened. Three files rapprochement is the most important. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that al-Assad plans to visit Russia, indicating that the date of the visit will be announced at a specific time for security reasons, according to what was reported by the Russian Novosti agency on March 6. Peskov's remarks came hours after a comment reported by the Russian newspaper Vedomosti from a source close to the Russian president's administration, stating that al-Assad will arrive on official visit to Moscow in mid-March and may be received by Putin. And Kremlin didn't comment on the reasons for al-Assad's visit to Moscow, while the newspaper quoted Russian experts as saying that humanitarian issues and international relations will be on the agenda of the visit. From Erdu Point, Damascus eyeing participation in talks with Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Moscow. Damascus is exploring a possibility of the deputy foreign ministers of Iran, Turkey, Russia, and Syria scheduled for March 15th in Moscow. Syrian Assistant Foreign Minister of Affairs and Expatriates Imran Suzan told Sputnik on Tuesday. And from Tasnim, Russia, Iran, Syria, Turkey to hold deputy foreign minister meeting in Moscow. The deputy foreign ministers of Russia, Iran, Syria, and Turkey are set to meet in Moscow on March 15th and 16th as part of efforts to normalize the relations between Ankara and Damascus. Earlier, Russia's special presidential envoy for the Middle East and Africa, Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov, told TASS that preparations for a four-party meeting were ongoing. Citing Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu, the Turkish state-run TRT TV channel reported that Monday that Moscow will host technical talks involving the four countries to discuss preparations for a meeting of their foreign ministers. The upcoming meeting followed consultations between the defense ministers of Russia, Syria, and Turkey in December 2022 aimed at normalizing the relations between Ankara and Damascus. The participants of the meeting agreed to create a trilateral commission. The top diplomats of the three countries are expected to hold a meeting to discuss the possibility of talks between President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey and Bashar al-Assad of Syria. Erdogan previously suggested that Russian President Vladimir Putin host a trilateral meeting involving Assad, preceded by a meeting between officials from intelligence agencies, defense, and foreign ministers. And from Daily Sabah, Turkish delegation set to hold talks with Syrian officials in Moscow. Russia will host a four-way meeting on Wednesday and Thursday between Turkiye, the Syrian regime, and Iran, diplomatic sources speaking to Turkish media outlets announced on Monday. Turkey's Deputy Foreign Minister Barak Occupier will lead the Turkish delegation for 2 days to normalize relations between Turkiye and the Syrian regime. Mikhail Bogdanov, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, who also serves as Putin's special representative for the Middle East, will represent the Kremlin. Ali Asghar Kaji, political affairs advisor to the Iranian foreign minister, will represent Tehran. Imran Suzan, deputy foreign minister of the Assad regime, will also participate in the talks. Last week, Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu announced that a Turkish delegation would visit Moscow for technical talks ahead of a planned Turkish, Russian, Iranian, and Syrian foreign ministers meeting. The Iranian side will also attend this meeting. At this meeting, preparations for the foreign ministers' meeting will be made, Cavusoglu said at a joint news conference with his Iranian counterpart Hossein Amir Abdullahian in the capital, Ankara. On December 28, 2022, the Turkish, Russian, and Syrian defense ministers met in Moscow to discuss counterterrorism efforts in Syria. They agreed to continue the tripartite meetings to ensure stability in Syria and the wider region. About the possibility of the inclusion of Iran into the talks, Turkey had previously said Ankara would be pleased if Iran is involved in this process. Although no date or location has been announced, the foreign ministers' meeting would mark another high-level talk since the Syrian civil war began in 2011. And from GulfNews.com, Assad visits Moscow as Putin pushes Syria-Turkey reconciliation. Moscow President Syrian President Bashar al-Assad on Wednesday will meet with Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to Moscow in Moscow as the Kremlin steps up efforts to restore ties between Turkey and Syria. The Russian capital on the same day will also host four-way talks involving Turkiye, Syria, and Iran. The diplomatic activity comes days after top U.S. military officials visited American troops and their Kurdish allies in northeastern Syria, where Washington has kept a presence for almost 8 years. The diplomatic push opposed by the U.S. comes after China brokered a diplomatic détente between Iran and U.S. ally Saudi Arabia, demonstrating its newfound weight in the region. The U.S. has about 900 troops in Syria, a presence that Moscow and Damascus have long sought to end. The U.S. reputation in the region would be undermined even more if the Americans tried to impede regional efforts to stabilize Syria and push the Kurdish agenda, said Nikolai Surkov, a Middle East analyst on the Moscow-based Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Other regional states are likely to follow the example of Turkey. The inclusion of Iran in the talks at the level of deputy foreign minister came after Turkiye indicated it didn't oppose Tehran's participation. The two-day meeting Wednesday and Thursday is intended to prepare the ground for consultations between the four countries' top diplomats. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu has said Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said he's willing to sit down with Assad to promote peace in the region. The Syrian leader, who arrived in Russia late Tuesday, will meet Putin to discuss political and economic cooperation, the Kremlin said. The rapprochement between Syria and Turkey, which has backed rebels fighting in Assad in war that started in 2011, has been pushed for by Damascus's major military backer, Russia. Syria remains under strict Western sanctions and is suspended from the Arab League, making it dependent on Iran, which also set fighters to back Assad in the conflict. And more news in a moment. From Asia.Nikkei.com, Pakistan police try to arrest ex-PM Imran Khan, confront supporters. Pakistani police in armored vehicles descended on former Prime Minister Imran Khan's home in Lahore on Tuesday, apparently intending to arrest him in a sharp escalation of the country's political tensions. Khan was facing new arrest warrants as he continues his raucous campaign to force elections, nearly a year after he was ousted in a no-confidence vote. On Twitter, his Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf party, PTI, urged supporters to hurry to the residence at Zaman Park but to stay calm. The situation quickly deteriorated as the growing crowd slowed the officers' advance. Footage showed the supporters blocking entrances to his house and throwing stones. Police reportedly resorted to using batons and tear gas while a helicopter was said to be circling Zaman Park. In a video message posted on Khan's Twitter account, the ousted prime minister said the police had come to arrest him. They think that if Imran Khan goes to jail, the masses will fall asleep, he said. You have to prove them wrong. Khan implored his supporters to keep up the fight regardless of Tuesday's outcome. If something happens to me, if I go to jail or if they kill me, you have to prove that even without Imran Khan, this nation will continue to struggle. The Associated Press reported that hours into the police operation, the officers had yet to arrest Khan and that they moved back at midnight. Since he was removed as prime minister in April 2022, Khan has been on a mission to disrupt the coalition government led by his successor Shehbaz Sharif and spur snap elections. The cricket star-turned-Islamist politician on Monday had led a large rally in Lahore, riding in a bulletproof car that wove through thousands of PTI backers. The same day, separate courts issued 2 non-bailable warrants for Khan after he ignored summonses. He's been refusing to appear in court, citing health issues and security concerns after he survived an apparent assassination attempt during a protest march last November. A court on Tuesday temporarily suspended one of the warrants, and the Islamabad High Court was due to hear the PTI's plea against another on Wednesday. But Khan's fate remained uncertain as the police swooped in and supporters confronted them. Pakistani Interior Minister Rana Sanaullah tweeted that person who ran away from the court would be arrested. Khan reportedly found a committee of senior PTI leadership to look after the affairs of the party and decide the next course of action in case he was taken into custody. Reuters quoted a government spokesperson who blamed the PTI for instigating violence. If Imran Khan ensures his presence in the court, it will be good. Otherwise, the law will take its course, the spokesman was quoted as saying. Khan's faced warrants and attempt to arrest him before, including one similar incident where he avoided a raid on his Lahore residence. The latest warrants were intended to haul him to court dates later this month concerning state gifts and remarks deemed to have threatened a judge. Khan faces a raft of charges, including allegedly concealing state gifts retained from the Tashakhana, a repository of items received from foreign governments. He and his supporters insist the allegations are politically motivated. While Khan wants fresh elections, the government is caught in worsening economic crisis and has insisted the national polls should be held in October as planned. The ruling Pakistan Democratic Movement Alliance argues that the conditions are not conducive to polls, given that the country is racing to prevent a financial default and has been dealing with a flurry of terrorist attacks by the local Taliban and other militant groups. But now political tensions are running even hotter after Khan dissolved 2 provincial assemblies as part of strategy to spur local and, by extension, national votes. Police and PTI supporters also clashed at another rally in Lahore last week, with the political party saying that one of the activists was killed. Khan claimed it was a case of custodial torture, while the police termed it a traffic accident. Experts suggest that any clampdown on Khan could backfire. It would be a high-stakes gamble for the state to try to sideline Khan, said Michael Kugelman, director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute, before Tuesday's development. He's a master populist who knows how to capitalize on the grievances of his growing support base. If the state cracks down on him, this could simply make him more popular. Polls show he doesn't need much help in that regard. A Gallup survey released last week gave Khan a 61% approval rating, while his opponents lag behind at 36%. Still, while the government appears to have few good options, the stakes are clearly high for Khan as well. The former prime minister faces dozens of charges, including allegations related to terrorism, criticism of state institutions, illicit foreign political funding, failing to declare dependent child, and not declaring income from the sale of Tashakhana gifts. Misdeclaration of assets, intentional or otherwise, can obviously result in disqualification from politics, said Osama Malik, an Islamabad-based lawyer. Former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, the brother of the current Prime Minister, was barred on similar grounds, though under a different article of the Constitution. Khan himself was disqualified as a National Assembly member by the Election Commission over the state gifts issue last October. The PTI challenged this in the Islamabad High Court, which did not impose a stay on the order, but said he was free to run in future elections. Khan went on to contest and win by elections. Currently, all eyes are on top upcoming provincial polls that Sharif's government would prefer to delay. The PTI, which was in control of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab provinces, dissolved these assemblies in January because the Constitution requires elections within 90 days of such dissolution. The idea seems to have been that the cash-strapped government would give in and hold a national election at the same time to save money. Last month, the Finance Ministry turned down the electoral agency's request to release the full funds for the provincial polls, but the Supreme Court ruled this month that the polls must go ahead. President Arif Alvi, who hails from Khan's PTI, has called for the Punjab election to be held on April 30th after the central government dithered on naming a date. The date of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa election has yet to be announced. While the outlook for the provincial polls remains uncertain, analysts say another key question is how Pakistan's powerful military views the political crisis. The PTI has appealed to the masses by loudly accusing Pakistan's political elite of corruption and ex-Army Chief General Qamar Bajwa of having a hand in orchestrating Khan's ouster. It's been a long time since Pakistani politics have been so polarized, and the military clearly isn't going to quickly forgive Khan for all the accusations and vitriol he's directed at the army leadership for nearly a year, said the Wilson Center's Kugelman. He also noted the history of bad blood between Khan and the new Army Chief General Saeed Asim Munir, who's fired a spy chief when Khan was prime minister. At the rally in Lahore on Monday, Khan did tone down some of his rhetoric, steering clear of criticizing the judiciary and military, but he appeared to have no intention of surrendering either to the courts or to his opponents. He announced another big rally in Lahore for this weekend. And from Dunya News, Imran Khan's arrested deep in prevailing crisis, Zalmay Khalilzad. or Khalilzad. Former U.S. Special Representative Afghanistan Reconciliation Zalmay Khalilzad has warned that the arrest of Imran Khan will deepen the crisis being faced by Pakistan. Taking to Twitter, Zalmay Khalilzad pointed out that Pakistan was facing a triple crisis: political, economic, and security. The former U.S. envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan offered Islamabad advice on how to deal with political, economic, and security crises facing the country. The sequential cannibalizing of its leaders through jailing, execution, assassination, etc. is the wrong path, Khalilzad said Tuesday on Twitter. Despite great potential, it's underperforming and falling from behind its arch-rival India, Zalmay Khalilzad said, adding that it was time for serious soul-searching, bold thinking, and strategizing. Arresting Imran Khan will only deepen the crisis, he said. I urge 2 steps. Set a date for national elections in early June to avert a meltdown, and 2, use the time for the main political parties to confront what's gone wrong and propose a specific plan to rescue and put the country on path to stability, security, and prosperity. Whichever party wins the elections will have a mandate from the people on what must be done. And from Al Jazeera, Pakistan Live News, security forces leaving Imran Khan's house. Law enforcement says former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan cannot be arrested until 10 a.m. on Thursday. Security forces have withdrawn from Imran Khan's residence in Lahore due to a cricket match scheduled to the city later on Wednesday, and police from the capital Islamabad had tried for a second day to arrest Khan for allegedly selling state gifts by foreign leaders when he was the Prime Minister. Khan says arrest bid a plot to bar him from election. Former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan said the government wanted him behind bars in order to stop him from taking part in general elections due later this year. The reason why this is happening is not because I broke any law. They want me in jail so that I cannot contest elections, he told the AFP news agency after the police called off a siege of his Lahore residence. And we'll be back with more news. And from ArabNews.com, Georgian Prime Minister tells Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky not to meddle in his country. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili accused Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of meddling in his country's political situation by commenting on protests there last week, prompting an angry response from Kiev. During the protests against a foreign agent law that critics have signaled is an authoritarian shift in Georgia, Zelensky thanked protesters for waving Ukrainian flags, saying it showed respect and he wished Georgians Democrats success. Last Friday, Georgia's parliament dropped the bill, which had threatened to harm Tbilisi's bid for closer ties with Europe. Critics has said it was inspired by a 2012 Russian law that's been used widely to crack down on dissent in Russia. When a person who is at war responds to the destructive action of several thousand people here in Georgia, this is direct evidence that this person's involved and motivated to make something happen here to change. Garibashvili said in an interview with the Georgian IMEDI television broadcast on Sunday, referring to Zelensky, "I want to wish everyone a timely end to this war and peace," Garibashvili added. However, Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesperson Ole Nikolenko accused Garibashvili of repeating Russian propaganda by suggesting that Kiev sought to draw Georgia into its conflict with Moscow. "We categorically reject such claims, which have nothing to do with reality. The Georgian authorities are looking for an enemy in the wrong place," Nikolenko said on Facebook on Monday. "Ukraine has been and will remain a friend of the Georgian people, whom we do not wish to stop in their task of building a European future." Despite Garibashvili's comments, Georgian public opinion is strongly pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian. Georgia fought its own brief war with Russia in 2008 over the status of 2 Moscow-backed breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia and Ukraine both aspire to join the European Union one day. And from TFI Global, NATO's pressing Georgia to follow the Ukraine model. The present ongoing protests in Georgia are reminiscent of 2014, the year when the fall of Ukraine started with the Euromaidan protests. Why do we say so? Here's why. 3 months into the year 2023, and it appears this is going to be crazier than 2022. Up till now, the Ukraine war was limited to the eastern part of Ukraine, but now spillover effects have started to erupt. While there are anti-NATO protests taking place in several European nations, a pro-NATO and pro-EU protest has taken the world by surprise. Last week, protests carrying Georgian, EU, and Ukrainian flags gathered outside the parliament building and shouted no to the Russian law. Georgia introduced 2 laws with the aim to block foreign interference in Georgian politics. The first bill on transparency of foreign influence aims to ensure transparency and envisages the registration of non-entrepreneurial, non-commercial legal entities and media outlets that receive more than 20% of their income from abroad as agents of foreign influence. The second bill on registration of foreign agents mandates any individual or legal entity receiving funds from abroad to register as a foreign agent. The author claims that the second draft is an exact copy of the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act against foreign agents, which was promulgated in 1938 as the U.S. responded to the threat of Nazism and other hostile ideologies. This has led to a widespread unrest in Georgia. Reportedly, demonstrators also blocked the city's central Rustaveli Avenue after calling for the main opposition party, the United National Movement, to gather there. However, Western leaders have expressed their full support for Georgia protests. The EU delegation in Georgia welcomed the announcement, saying it wanted to encourage all political leaders in Georgia to resume pro-EU reforms in an inclusive and constructive way. The EU is also considering Georgia's application for candidate status. Previously, the European Council President Charles Michel warned that the adoption of the so-called Foreign Agent Bill was not compatible with the EU path. EU's move in support of anarchy has left the Georgian government in doubt. They are now labeling the protesters as an attempt of interference. Protests. Georgia raises questions. Reportedly, the Georgia Prime Minister has accused the West and Ukraine of spreading the unrest deliberately. Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili has lashed out at Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky for rallying support for the mass protests in Tbilisi, Georgia. Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili has alleged that Kiev is to blame for the unrest caused by Georgia's contentious foreign agents law and has urged Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to take care of his own rather than inciting unrest in Tbilisi. Garibashvili vehemently denounced Zelensky's support, accusing him of attempting to establish a second front in Georgia against Russia earlier this week. Zelensky issued a video addressed to Georgians stating that every Ukrainian wishes a democratic and European success to the country. Garibashvili also charged Kiev with long-standing efforts to undermine Georgia, which he claimed predated the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. He claimed that the Kievs specifically sent former Georgian president and current Ukrainian official Mikhail Saakashvili home in October 2021 to stage a coup. Saakashvili was deliberately sent in. The main objective was to stage a coup here and prompt the nation to go to war. Today we have no doubts about it, said Garibashvili. The prime minister also claimed that a few dozen Georgian fighters returned from Ukraine, and the unrest over the foreign agents law urged them to have no illusions over the situation in the country. We know significantly more than they could imagine, he warned, adding that no second front will take place while the ruling Georgian Dream Party remains in power. Now here the question arises, in what exactly is the second front? Well, second front's an idea that's been long in the discussions by the NATO allies. If one remembers, last year in September, there's been reports that NATO are vying over the options of opening new fronts against Russia to slow Moscow's gains in Ukraine. So Georgia's proposed holding a referendum and asking if Georgians want war with Russia. Reportedly, the Georgian authorities were considering holding a national referendum on whether or not Georgians want to go to war with Russia. At a press conference held in the headquarters of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, Georgia Kobakhidze, the party's chairman, announcing the motion in a pretty heroic motion. Minister Kobakhidze had to emphasize, let the people decide if they want to open a second front in Georgia against Russia. He further added, we'll act as people say. However, Prime Minister Garibashvili later on derailed these plans, saying that Georgia could turn into a shooting range if opposition leaders had managed to take control of the country. He said that Kiev harassed Tbilisi to join the confrontation with Russia. It's worth noting, when Russia's again advancing into crucial Ukrainian cities, the accusations of Second Front have started emerging or have started emerging, but because the Prime Minister of the Georgian Dream Party is against the motion, protests have widened across Georgia. This appears to be own Euromaidan protest of Georgia to ensure Georgia goes down the Ukraine way. Euromaidan reboot. It was only Euromaidan protest, also known as the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, that hastened Ukraine's shift to the west. The civil unrest that began in November 2013 started after then-President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to suspend negotiations with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. As the Georgia protests grew in size and intensity, the Ukrainian government responded with force, using riot police and special forces to disperse protests and impose a state of emergency. The conflict between the Ukrainian government and the Euromaidan protests quickly escalated, with clashes becoming increasingly violent. In February 2014, Yanukovych was ousted from power by a coalition of opposition leaders, and a new government was formed. After that, Ukraine followed every step and statement of Western leaders, and now, 7 years later, Ukraine is a battleground between Russia and the West. Georgia is now being pushed upon the same path now. Tbilisi didn't want a war against Moscow. As the reports start to emerge, that final battle for Kiev is about to begin as Russia's forces are lining up at Ukraine's border. But now Georgia protests and unrest have now erupted, making it sure that Georgian Dream Party spirals out of Georgian politics and someone pro-West storms into power. The second front against Russia has started to emerge, and here on the escalation of war looks highly likely. And from Yeni Safak, Russian diplomat says West creates a tension in Georgia, Moldova for confrontation with Moscow. Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko says West trying to dictate Georgia, Moldova what to do. The West creates hotbeds of tensions in Georgia and Moldova for confrontation with Russia, Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko said on Tuesday. Speaking to the state-run TASS news agency, Grushko said Russia is concerned over recent developments in these countries, as they have key significance for the country's security interests. Of course, we're concerned about the situation in Georgia and the situation in Moldova because these are our neighbors, and we see that the U.S. and its satellites are working to create more and more hotbeds of tensions along our borders and are trying to arrange some kind of geopolitical competitions in these zones, which are key even for geographical reasons for the security interests of the Russian Federation, Grushko stressed. The diplomat added that Western states demonstrate a neo-colonial approach, acting in a way that only they have the right to dictate what to do to Georgia and Moldova. While in Georgia there was mass protest against a foreign agency's law, which was later dropped, Moldova has had a new government following a prolonged economic crisis, and tensions have also risen in the breakaway regions of Transnistria. Turning to investigation of last year's Nord Stream pipeline blast, Grushko said Russia is going to seek absolute clarity of all the circumstances of the sabotage. We proceed from the fact that it's necessary to put an end to this story, to deal with those who are guilty, and they should be held accountable, he said. From Press TV, Georgian Premier warns Ukraine Zelensky against meddling in country's domestic affairs. The Georgian Prime Minister has accused Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of meddling in his country's domestic affairs by commenting on ongoing protests against a controversial bill claimed to be inspired by Russia. Over the past days, thousands of people have taken to the streets of Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, to protest against a foreign agent's draft law, which targets the disclosure of money flows from abroad. The proposed legislation stipulates that organizations such as media outlets could be classified as foreign agents if they receive more than 20% of the funding from abroad. Critics claim the legislation is a way for the Georgian government to crack down on opposing voices. Detractors have also pointed to a similar law passed in Russia, where all organizations or individuals receiving financial support from abroad or under some form of a foreign influence are declared foreign agents. Reacting to the protests in Georgia, Zelensky thanked the demonstrators for waving Ukrainian flags and said it showed respect for Kiev, wishing Georgian democratic success. According to reports, at least 66 people were arrested on Tuesday evening as the protests turned violent. When a person who's at war responds to the destructive action of several thousand people here in Georgia, this is direct evidence that this person is involved, motivated to make something happen here too, to change, Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili said in an interview with the state TV on Sunday. I want to wish everyone a timely end to this war and peace, Garibashvili said. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Saturday likened the protest to a coup attempt being orchestrated from abroad to create an irritant on Russia's borders. Stressing that the foreign agents legislation had been used as an excuse to start, generally speaking, an attempt to change the government by force, Lavrov equated the rallies with Kiev's Maidan uprising that toppled a Russian-friendly administration in Ukraine in 2014. Georgia fought its own brief war with Russia in 2008 over the status of the two Moscow-backed breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia applied for EU membership together with Ukraine and Moldova days after Russia launched a military campaign in Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Russia began its special military operation in Ukraine with a declared aim of demilitarizing Donbass, which is made up of the Donetsk and Luhansk self-proclaimed republics. Back in 2014, the two republics, which are predominantly Russian-speaking, broke away from Ukraine, prompting Kiev to launch a bloody war against both regions. The years-long conflict has killed more than 14,000 people, mostly in the Donbass. Since the onset of the conflict between the two countries, the United States and European allies have unleashed an array of unprecedented sanctions against Russia and poured numerous batches of advanced weapons into Ukraine to help its military fend off the Russian troops, despite repeated warnings by the Kremlin that such measures will only prolong the war. And watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, share, and subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
is obviously the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Well, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction.
The whole notion of
Demonstrated our
logic.
superior weapons, they should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable,
The whole
provable.
notion
You'd
of
make
logic.
a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Israeli government pushes on with divisive legal overhaul. From Punjab News Express, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu coalition advanced 3 bills which are key parts of its proposed judicial overhaul plans that have divided Israel's society over the past 2 years or 2 months. The bills were brought up for voting in the early morning hours of Tuesday after a fierce debate. Lawmakers with Netanyahu's new ultra-religious and ultra-nationalist government voted in favor of a bill that would allow the Knesset parliament to cancel Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote. The bill was adopted by a 62 to 52 vote in a first non-binding reading, meaning it still needs to pass 2 more rounds of voting before becoming a law, Xinhua news agency reported. The Knesset also voted in a first reading in favor of a law that would cancel the Supreme Court's authority to declare a prime minister unfit for office for any reason other than physical or mental impairments. The third bill, which was also approved in the first reading, calls for the legislation of 4 unpermitted settlements in the occupied West Bank. The 4, Homesh, Sanur, Ganim, and Kadim, were evacuated in 2005 as part of Israel's disengagement plan, in which it withdrew its forces from the Gaza Strip. The ruling coalition says the proposed overhaul is needed in order to curb the overly activist Supreme Court, but critics fear that it will give unrestrained power to Netanyahu, who's facing a criminal trial over corruption charges, and his government. The proposed plans have created an uproar with weekly massive demonstrations across the nation. And from Arab News, Ramallah, Israeli authorities' use of the term Judea and Samaria government in official documents to describe the West Bank has raised Palestinians' concerns of a ploy to silently annex settlements in the area. Ismail Mansour, a Palestinian expert on Israeli affairs, told Arab News that Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich is implementing plans to annex the West Bank, bypassing bureaucratic, administrative, and political obstacles and ignoring external pressure as he seeks to subject the area to Israeli law. Mansour said that annexing the West Bank to Israel might not affect the lives of 3 million Palestinians, but would certainly affect the Palestinian Authority politically and legally. With the PA calling for a 2-state solution, annexation will make the West Bank non-negotiable and subject to Israeli law, he said. More than 650,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Area C constitutes about 60% of the West Bank. Sources say that Israeli military authorities have used Judea and Samaria Brigade, a military term for the West Bank, for the past 55 years. Palestinian drivers say that tickets issued by Israeli traffic police when they travel between Palestinian cities bear the logo of Judea and Samaria Governorate, while the signs of some roads and places have been changed to carry the new name. Palestinian political analyst Ghassan al-Khatib told Arab News that Smotrich is taking small steps toward formal annexation in the face of international pressure. Smotrich's measures, which aim to annex Area C to Israel, should alarm the PA, he added. Israeli affairs expert Majdi Halabi told Arab News that Smotrich is trying to improve the living conditions of settlers in the West Bank in bringing them in line with those of Israeli citizens in Tel Aviv. Halabi added that Smotrich's assumption of responsibility for the civil administration gives him powers related to Israeli settlers in the West Bank. The only problem with this is if you are not living in Israel, you're not an Israeli citizen. You should not be voting, and the government should not be protecting you and taking care. I mean, it makes no sense that people that live outside of Israel are influencing its politics. The Israeli civil administration has significantly increased its dealing with Palestinian civilian affairs without going through the PA, while dealing with the settlers takes place through Israeli government ministries.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
The Israeli civil administration has significantly increased its dealings with Palestinians' civilian affairs without going through the Palestinian Authority, while dealing with the settlers takes place through Israeli government ministries. Why isn't the Palestinian Authority dealing with Israeli civilian issues? See how preposterous that sounds? Zionist journalist Diana Ben Shimon of Israel Today said that Smotrich wants to transfer the powers of the Zionist occupying forces civil administration regarding settlers in the West Bank to Zionist ministries because he doesn't believe that the Zionists are occupying the territory, but constantly repeats, "We're not guests, we are the owners of the land." Ben Shimon said that Smotrich wants government ministries to control the management of Zionist settlements, of Zionist occupations in the West Bank, and occupiers he considers Zionist citizens. He also looks forward to annexing the settlements to Israel in Area C. Zionist political analyst Yoni Ben Menachem believes that Smotrich is trying to equate the rights of occupiers in the West Bank with those of other occupying citizens. Smotrich wants to solve all settler problems in the West Bank, legitimizing occupation outposts and providing them with services such as water and electricity, and increasing Zionist influence in the West Bank, which will increase the level of political support for him among the occupiers, said Ben Menachem. Nevertheless, the Zionist parliament, the Knesset, approved in its first reading on Tuesday a bill to abolish the separation withdrawal law, or what is known as disengagement from settlements in the northern West Bank. According to the bill, a ban will be lifted on occupiers entering and staying in the evacuated northern West Bank settlement areas, as well as recently evacuated outposts including Homesh between Nablus and Jenin. Palestinians inside Israel and its West Bank are preparing to commemorate Land Day on March 30th with protests against the Zionist occupation. From Middle East Eye, Israel Netanyahu moved a step closer with judicial coup bill in parliament. Israel's parliament on Tuesday moved a step closer to passing a bill that would allow politicians to overturn high court judgments with a simple majority as well as appoint judges. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned legislation to overhaul the country's judiciary has been described as a judicial coup. In an overnight session that stretched into the early morning, the Knesset also approved several other pieces of legislation, including legislation that would prevent the country's attorney general from declaring Netanyahu unfit for office. The prime minister would only be declared unfit for office due to physical or mental inability, and then only by the prime minister himself or by the vote of 3/4 of cabinet members. The parliament also passed a piece of legislation that would expand settlements in the West Bank. In a further potential blow to the judiciary, the Israeli parliament also voted for a bill that would require a consensus of 12 out of 15 judges to strike down legislation that was ruled unconstitutional. The same bill would allow Parliament to override the Supreme Court with a simple majority while demanding a supermajority for the highest court to do the same. As it stands, only a simple majority is needed in the Supreme Court to strike down laws passed by the Zionist parliament. Each of the bills requires additional votes before being enshrined into law. The fact that these bills are making their way through Parliament against a backdrop of historic protests in Israel against Netanyahu's attempts to weaken the judiciary has not dampened the government's agenda. The bill overhauling the judiciary also has a retrospective clause allowing Parliament to overrule previous judgments by the court, whereas another bill would repeal section of the 2005 disengagement law, which resulted in Israeli settlers evacuating 4 settlements in 2005, and which could now see those settlements being reoccupied. Israeli political crisis. Israel is in the midst of a political crisis that's pitted Netanyahu's far-right government against the country's civil society, academic, and business elite, and former government ministers and military figures. In an open letter on Sunday, more than 250 U.S. business leaders and politicians warned that Israel judicial reforms will make it increasingly difficult to defend the country internationally. Many leaders in the business community will feel compelled to reevaluate their reliance on Israel as a strategic destination for investment, sourcing talent, building engineering centers, and maintaining intellectual property. Business leaders warned in their open letter. Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption, and the reforms could enable him to evade conviction or see his case dismissed. Since being indicted in 2019, Netanyahu has railed publicly against the justice system, calling it biased against him. Israel has been engulfed in political turmoil for over 2 months, as tens of thousands of people continue to take to the streets in mass protest. Demonstrators want the government to scrap the controversial judicial overhaul plan that they say threatens checks and balances in the country. The demonstrators have been growing, drawing in supporters from various professions, including the military, the justice system, and the high-tech sector. In light of their proposed reforms, the Zionist currency has declined, and the leading U.S. financial institute, J.P. Morgan, has warned of a growing risk of investing in the country. I'm from China.org. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition advanced on Tuesday 3 bills which are the key part of the proposed judicial overhaul plans that have divided Israel's society over the past 2 months. The bills were brought up for voting in the early morning hours after a fierce debate. Lawmakers with Netanyahu's new ultra-religious and ultra-nationalist government voted in favor of a bill that would allow the Knesset parliament to cancel Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote. The bill was adopted by a 62-52 vote in first non-binding reading, meaning it still needs to pass 2 more rounds of voting before becoming a law. The Knesset also voted in first reading in favor of a law that would cancel the Supreme Court's authority to declare a prime minister unfit for office for any reason other than physical or mental impairments. And the third bill, which was also approved in the first reading, calls for the legalization of 4 unpermitted settlements in the occupied West Bank. Homesh, Sanur, Ganim, and Khadim were evacuated in 2005 as part of Israel's disengagement plan, in which it withdrew its forces from the Gaza Strip. The ruling coalition says that the proposed overhaul is needed in order to curb the overly active Supreme Court. But critics fear that it will give unrestrained power to Netanyahu, who's facing a criminal trial over corruption charges, and his government. I mean, that's one of the, and we've read that in a few articles there. That's a huge understatement that it could either curb the overly activist Supreme Court, or it could give Netanyahu unrestrained power. I mean, the extreme scenarios of that are probably what will happen. And from Memo, Israel advances bill enabling return to illegal settlements evacuated in 2015. Israel's far-right occupation government advanced a bill yesterday that would enable settlers to return to areas of the West Bank evacuated in 2005 as part of the disengagement law enacted by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. According to Haaretz, the bill headed by Likud Knesset member Yuli Edelstein passed by a majority of 40 in favor, with 17 MKs opposing it. The introductory text to the amendment states there is no longer any justification to prevent Israelis from entering and staying in the evacuated territory in northern Samaria, so-called Samaria, and therefore it's proposed to state that these sanctions of the disengagement will no longer apply to the evacuated territory. The bill would repeal the clauses of the disengagement law that ban Israelis from living in the region where the 4 illegal settlements of Nomesh, Kanem, Kadem, and Sanur previously stood in the northern occupied West Bank. Edelstein and Israeli National Missions Minister Orit Struk sponsored the measure following the request of the head of the Settlements Council in the occupied West Bank, Yossi Dagan, who expressed his pleasure at the government's decision. This is the start of correcting a historical injustice. I expect the law to be completely repealed. This is a struggle we've been waging for 18 years, and we finally see the light at the end of the tunnel, said Dagan last month, after the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed a preliminary reading of the bill last month with 62 MKs in favor and 36 against. All of Israel's settlements and settlers are illegal under international law. In 2005, the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon enacted a law requiring unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and the northern West Bank and the removal of 25 illegal settlements in the two areas. 21 settlements in Gaza have already been removed and 8,000 settlers have been evacuated. In the occupied West Bank, 4 illegal settlements were evacuated, but the structures in them were maintained in the areas labeled closed military zones. And from Press TV, Hamas condemns Israeli bill allowing settlers return to evacuated illegal settlements. The Palestinian resistance movement Hamas has strongly denounced the approval of a new bill by Israel that enables settlers to return to areas of the occupied West Bank evacuated in 2005, saying the move amounts to an all-out war against Palestinians. The movement said in a statement on Tuesday that the bill aims to Judaize Palestinian lands, noting that Palestinian youths will certainly be confronted with more resistance. Hamas further urged the international community to prevent such measures by the Israeli regime, which are a clear violation of international law. It's also called for an immediate action to stop the Israeli regime's occupation and aggression against Palestinians and their holy sites. On Monday, the Israeli parliament, known as the Knesset, approved a draft bill that would repeal the clauses of the disengagement law that banned Israelis from living in the northern West Bank, allowing them to return for the 4 evacuated illegal settlements of Homish, Ghanim, Kadem, and Sanur in the area. The bill, sponsored by the Knesset member Yuli Edelstein and Israeli extremist minister Orit Struk, was passed with 40 votes in favor and 17 against. There's no longer any justification to prevent Israelis from entering and staying in the West evacuated territory and northern so-called Samaria. In 2005, then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon enacted a law requiring unilateral withdrawal from the besieged Gaza Strip and the northern West Bank and the removal of 25 illegal settlements in the two areas. 21 settlements in Gaza have already been removed, and 8,000 settlers have been evacuated in the occupied West Bank. 4 illegal settlements were evacuated, but the structures in them were maintained in the areas were labeled closed military zones. The Israeli regime has already authorized new settlement outposts and pledged to construct new settler units in the West Bank. More than 600,000 Zionists live in over 230 occupations built since the 1967 Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East al-Quds. The international community views the occupations, hundreds of which have been built across the West Bank since Tel Aviv's occupation of the territory in 1967, as illegal under international law and the Geneva Conventions due to their construction on the occupied territories. The UN Security Council has condemned Israel's settlement activities in the occupied territories in several resolutions. And from Al Monitor, Hamas says leadership visited Russia, met Sergei Lavrov. The Palestinian armed group Hamas said on Tuesday that it sent a high-level delegation to Russia and held talks with Russian Foreign Ministry Sergei Lavrov. In an interview published on Hamas website, Saleh al-Aruri, deputy head of Hamas political bureau, said political party leaders visited Russia and met Lavrov, and that the visit was a reflection of Hamas's weight among major global powers. The leadership of the movement visited Moscow and met Sergei Lavrov. It was an important visit that highlights the role of the movement with many global actors, Aruri said. He added that there might be another international Hamas trip in the coming weeks. Aruri did not specify when the visit to Moscow took place, saying only that it happened recently. I'm going to open up a channel and beam me up.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up.
Lock on transporters. Beam us up.
Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home.
Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.